The spoon trembled before it reached her mouth. Even after 15 years, her hands remembered what her mind tried to forget. The candles flickered between us, reflecting on the silverware like tiny shards of memory. The smell of mushroom soup, the same one she once made for me, hung in the air, heavy and familiar. I had prepared everything to feel identical to that night. The same tablecloth, the same plates, even the same clock ticking on the wall at the same rhythm it did when I was 19. The house was silent, but my heartbeat wasn't. It pulsed against my ribs like it wanted to warn me. Some ghosts don't stay buried just because time has passed. 15 years is a long time to hold your breath. It's a long time to live pretending you've forgiven someone who never asked to be forgiven. But I wasn't there for closure. I was there for truth. As I watched her lift the spoon, I saw her eyes narrow just slightly, the recognition of something too familiar. She didn't know what scared her more, the taste or the memory it carried. For years, I wondered what I would do if I ever saw her again. Would I yell? Would I cry? Would I walk away? None of those things felt powerful enough. I wanted her to sit in her own silence, to feel the weight of what she had done without me saying a word. Because silence, when you've earned it, can be louder than any scream. There was an envelope next to her glass, brown, sealed, untouched. Inside it lived the story she pretended never happened. Receipts, reports, the truth that could no longer be ignored. I hadn't decided when I would let her see it. Tonight wasn't about confrontation. It was about preparation. The calm before the truth is often more terrifying than the truth itself. I had learned something over the years. Revenge isn't about hurting someone back. It's about reclaiming the space they once poisoned inside you. If you've ever looked into the eyes of the person who tried to destroy you and felt your heartbeat steady instead of race, you know the power I'm talking about. If you understand that kind of quiet strength, stay with me, because this story isn't about bitterness. It's about transformation. I adjusted the napkin on my lap and met her eyes again. She smiled politely, unaware that I had rebuilt my life on the ashes she left behind. Everything she destroyed had turned into the structure of my survival. As the clock struck 7:45, the same minute she once handed me that fatal bowl, I felt the old fear dissolve into something sharper. Purpose. This was no longer her dinner. It was mine. And I had been waiting 15 years to serve it. I remember the night by the color of the light. It wasn't bright, not dim. Just that strange orange glow that comes from a single kitchen bulb, humming above an argument no one dares to finish. I was 19, standing in the middle of the house I was already planning to leave. My suitcase sat half-packed in my room, and the future felt like an open road waiting for me to step onto it. I thought I was free, but freedom has a way of angering the people who can't control it. She didn't like the person I was becoming, the independence, the choices, the love I had chosen. I could feel her disapproval in the air like static, an invisible charge that made every breath taste bitter. Still, I stayed that night, one last dinner before leaving. I wanted peace, a small truce, something to remember that didn't hurt. The kitchen smelled of mushrooms and garlic, the same dish she used to make when I was little. I told myself it was her way of saying she cared, even if she couldn't say it out loud. I was wrong. When I took the first spoonful, I felt warmth. Then a slow, creeping wrongness. A metallic taste spread through my mouth, subtle at first, then sharp, cutting through the flavor I used to love. My stomach tightened, my pulse shifted. The room began to tilt slightly, as if gravity had turned uncertain. I remember thinking it must be exhaustion. I had worked that morning, skipped lunch, and stress can make the body behave strangely. But then my skin began to sweat, cold and thin, like glass fogging from the inside. I tried to stand, and the floor felt far away. She was moving around the kitchen, blurred shapes, fading sound. My vision tunneled until the edges turned black. Somewhere in the distance, I heard her footsteps, slow and deliberate, and I wondered if she was coming to help me or just watching. There was a moment of clarity, a single flash, when I understood what was happening. It wasn't food poisoning. It wasn't exhaustion. It was intent. That realization was heavier than the sickness itself. The thought that the hands that once held me as a baby could hold something that could kill me now. The rest was a blur of tiles and breath. I remember the taste of the cold floor, the echo of my heartbeat against it, and the strange calm that comes when you stop fighting to stay awake. I thought I was dying, and somehow, in that suspended moment, I accepted it. When I opened my eyes again, the world had changed. White walls, a ceiling that hummed with fluorescent light, and a distant beeping that told me I was still alive. I didn't know how I got there or who called for help. My memory of that part was erased by the weight of betrayal. Recovery didn't come with peace. The doctors said it was a reaction, an accident. Everyone believed her, her tears, her trembling voice, her story of concern. No one saw the fear in my eyes when she entered the room. No one noticed the way I stopped breathing until she left. Lying in that hospital bed, I realized something. The body can recover from poison, but the soul takes longer. It took me years to understand that night was not about death. It was about rebirth. The version of me that trusted her died on that kitchen floor. The version that survived began breathing again in that sterile room. I never went back home after that. I left without a goodbye, carrying nothing but silence, and the memory of a spoon trembling in a shaking hand. 15 years is a long time to stay quiet. It's long enough for wounds to form their own language, a silence that speaks louder than confrontation, a stillness that remembers everything. I built my life inside that silence. It became the foundation for every choice I made after that night. When I left the hospital, I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me worth turning toward. I changed cities, changed my number, even changed the way I walked. Slower, more careful, like someone who had learned that trust can kill. The first few months were a blur of cheap apartments, overworked days, and nights that ended in empty kitchens where I couldn't bear to touch a pot or pan. Cooking used to be joy. After her, it became a trigger. But survival has strange methods. You either let the past rot inside you or you learn to compost it, to turn decay into growth. Slowly, I returned to the kitchen, but not to feed anyone else. I cooked only for myself, measuring every ingredient as if my life depended on precision. In a way, it did. The first meal I made without fear was plain and unremarkable. Boiled rice and vegetables, eaten under a flickering light in a rented room that smelled of dust. Yet it felt like a ritual, a declaration that I could still create something nourishing in a world that once tried to poison me. I started working at a small cafe, washing dishes at first, then prepping salads, then learning pastry. I watched chefs move like conductors, controlling chaos with knives and timing. Food had once been the tool of my destruction. Now it became the medium of my rebirth. Every plate I touched was a rebellion. Every recipe was proof that I was still alive. Years passed, marked not by birthdays but by progress. I moved from one restaurant to another, learning, adapting, saving. Eventually, I opened a small place of my own, nothing fancy, just 8 tables and a kitchen window that framed the sunset. I called it sombra, a word that means shadow. I liked the honesty of it. It reminded me that even in light, darkness always lingers, and pretending otherwise is a kind of blindness. Success didn't erase the past, it only made it quieter. People came to eat and left happy, unaware that the woman smiling behind the counter had once tasted death from a spoon. I became good at pretending. Pretending is a skill survivors master early. There were moments when I thought of her, usually late at night, when the kitchen was clean and the world outside had gone still. I wondered if she thought of me, or if she believed I was gone. Sometimes I imagined her old, sitting at that same table, making that same soup, convincing herself that guilt was just a dream she could wake from. But guilt never sleeps. It lingers, restless and patient, waiting for the right moment to breathe again. Every year on the anniversary of that night, I lit a candle in my kitchen. I didn't pray, and I didn't mourn. I just watched the flame tremble and reminded myself that I was still here. Stronger, quieter, sharper. If you've ever rebuilt your life from the ruins of betrayal, you know that healing isn't a straight line. It loops, it breaks, it circles back when you least expect it. There were days when I felt proud, and others when I felt hollow. But even in the emptiness, I carried purpose. People came and went. Lovers, friends, strangers. I kept my story sealed inside me. Some secrets are too poisonous to share. They change the air around you when spoken. So I stayed silent, smiling for the world while my past slept just beneath my skin. It took 15 years for silence to start cracking. It began with something small. An email, misplaced, misdirected, arriving at midnight. It carried a name I hadn't seen in years. The subject line was simple, but it made my chest tighten. About that night. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it for hours, the cursor blinking like a pulse. The quiet life I'd built suddenly felt fragile, as if one message could unravel everything. I realized then that the past doesn't vanish. It waits, patient and precise, for the moment you finally have enough strength to face it. When I finally clicked the message, I felt the air leave the room. 15 years of silence were about to end. The message had no greeting, no explanation, just a few lines that turned the air around me into glass. It came from a name I recognized immediately, a ghost from the margins of my past. Someone who used to orbit my mother's world, a man who was always around but never looked anyone directly in the eye. His words were clumsy, written late at night, blurred with guilt and alcohol. But between the rambling sentences, one line burned clear. "She told me what she did to you." I read it over and over until the words lost shape. My hands felt cold even though the kitchen was warm. For years I had convinced myself that proof didn't matter, that I didn't need confirmation to know the truth. But evidence has a strange gravity. It doesn't heal. It pulls. It drags everything you've buried back to the surface. I sat there for hours, reading the same lines until the sun began to rise through the restaurant window. Outside, the street looked the same as it always did, but the world felt different. I wasn't imagining it anymore. I wasn't the crazy daughter who misunderstood. I was the survivor of something deliberate. I printed the email and folded it carefully, as if it were something alive. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. I slipped it into a folder that already held other fragments of that night. The hospital report, the toxicology results marked inconclusive, the recipe card with her handwriting, the one she used the last time I saw her. Each piece had once been meaningless on its own, but together they formed a mosaic of intent. I kept the folder hidden for weeks, moving it from place to place like contraband. Sometimes I would take it out just to look at it, not to read but to remind myself that truth had form now. It had weight. It existed outside my memory. But truth is rarely content to sit quietly. It whispers. It wants to be known. And once it wakes, it doesn't go back to sleep. I began noticing her again, not in person, but in fragments. Her name appeared in small ways. A tagged photo on social media, an article about a charity event, an old neighbor mentioning her name online. Each time, it felt like the universe tapping on glass, asking if I was finally ready to look back. At night, I dreamed of the old kitchen, not of the poison, but of the moment before it. The calm, the illusion of safety. In the dream, I was always sitting at that table, watching her hands stir the pot. No sound, just motion. When I woke up, I could still smell mushrooms. One evening, while closing the restaurant, I opened the email again. This time I scrolled down further, past the confession, to a single line that hadn't registered before. The man had written about a small bottle she'd bought years earlier, a pesticide meant for rats. He said he'd helped her find it, that she'd mentioned needing it for the old house. The date matched the week I nearly died. It was enough. The pattern was complete. She had lied not just to me, but to everyone, and done it with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing she'll never be caught. That belief had kept her safe for 15 years. I decided I wasn't going to let it keep her safe any longer. The plan didn't arrive all at once. It grew slowly, like frost forming on glass. I began writing notes in the margins of my ledger, ideas hidden between grocery orders and delivery lists. It wasn't revenge I was plotting. It was revelation. I didn't want her gone. I wanted her exposed. In the quiet hours of the morning, when the kitchen was empty and only the hum of the refrigerators filled the air, I rehearsed what I might say to her. Not the words themselves, but the rhythm, calm, measured, precise, the way a surgeon prepares for a procedure. I started collecting the old documents, digitizing them, filing everything neatly. I placed the printed email on top, sealing it all in a brown envelope, the same color she once used to pack my school lunches. I smiled at the irony. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive like thunder. It creeps in like the dawn, unnoticed until the light touches everything. By the end of that week, I knew exactly what I would do. I would invite her to dinner. Not to feed her, not to harm her, but to make her sit at the same table where truth had once been silenced. It wouldn't be poison this time. It would be honesty. Slow, deliberate, and impossible to swallow. The decision came quietly, almost politely, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. There was no sudden rush of anger, no cinematic moment of realization. Just stillness, the kind that comes when everything finally aligns. I would invite her to dinner. It would be the same meal, in the same hour, with the same scent that once carried death through the air. But this time, the poison would be truth. Planning it felt disturbingly natural. Maybe because revenge, when disguised as closure, wears the clothes of peace. I began with the smallest details: the linen for the table, the shape of the candles, the angle of the chairs. Every choice was deliberate, a quiet echo of the past. I wanted her to walk into the room and feel a memory she couldn't name pressing against her ribs. I wanted the air itself to recognize her before I said a word. I chose Saturday evening. It had been a Saturday back then, too. The calendar matched almost perfectly. Midwinter, the kind of cold that keeps people indoors. I wrote the invitation on thick paper, my handwriting careful and even. It was short, polite, and stripped of emotion. I didn't mention the reason. People rarely refuse what they don't understand. When the letter was sealed, I stared at it for a long time before placing it in the envelope. The edges felt heavy, as if the weight of every unspoken word had been pressed into the paper. I didn't mail it. I delivered it myself, slipping it through the narrow slot of her door like a secret returning home. The days that followed were quiet, filled with attention so precise it almost became comfort. I kept working at the restaurant, smiling for customers, plating dishes, wiping counters, the ritual of routine disguising the storm underneath. At night, I sat at my table, rewriting the menu for the dinner in my mind. Not just food, but meaning. Every ingredient chosen with intention. Mushrooms, of course. The same kind she once used. The same aroma, the same texture, nostalgia in edible form. But there would be more. Roasted chestnuts for the bitterness, thyme for the memory, red wine for the truth that stains. I spent hours perfecting the balance. To anyone else, it would taste comforting. To her, it would taste familiar in the worst possible way. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if I was becoming like her. Controlled, calculating, capable of using the quiet to hurt. But then I remembered the difference. She used deception to destroy. I used reflection to reveal. I wasn't planning her suffering. I was planning her awareness. The restaurant closed early that Friday. I stayed behind, sitting at the bar under dim light, tracing the rim of my glass. I thought about the first night I had eaten without fear, the slow rebuilding of my trust in the act of nourishment. Food had become my language, my proof that creation could exist without cruelty. Now I was using it one more time, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. When the invitation was finally accepted, I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no dread, just inevitability. The story had always been moving toward this point. 15 years of silence had stretched thin, Something had to give. I began to prepare the setting days in advance. The same table from my restaurant moved into my home. Candles chosen to cast soft light that would catch the reflection of the wine glasses. I tested every plate twice. I timed the oven to the minute, as if precision could protect me from emotion. Each night, before sleeping, I rehearsed the rhythm of the evening. The way I would sit, how I would move my hands, the moment I would place the envelope beside her. Fear didn't visit me anymore. What replaced it was something colder, steadier. It wasn't hate. Hate burns too fast. This was discipline, a kind of devotion to balance the scales, not through destruction, but exposure. The morning of the dinner, I woke before the alarm. The sky was pale, the world quiet. I brewed coffee and watched the steam rise, the smell of roasted beans mixing with the faint scent of thyme from the kitchen. There was peace in that stillness, the fragile kind that comes before something irreversible. Throughout the day, I cleaned the house until the floor shone. I laid out the tablecloth with the precision of a surgeon dressing a wound. I placed 2 wine glasses, aligned perfectly, and 1 brown envelope resting by the edge of her seat. The envelope looked ordinary, almost harmless, yet it carried the entire gravity of what was about to unfold. As evening approached, the sun folded behind the trees, leaving the room in a soft, golden shadow. I checked the clock. 7:30, 15 minutes until the past walked through my door. I took one last look at the table and felt the faint hum of my pulse against my wrist. The meal was ready, the candles lit, the air scented with memory. It was no longer a dinner. It was a reckoning disguised as hospitality. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't afraid of her presence. I was waiting for it. And when she arrived, I would serve her the only thing she'd never tasted before, the truth she tried to bury inside me. The knock came exactly when I expected it to. Soft, punctual, rehearsed. The sound folded into the air like a memory rehearsing its return. I didn't rush to answer. I let the silence breathe for a few seconds, the same way one lets a dish rest before serving. Timing, I'd learned, was everything. When I opened the door, the cold from outside slipped past me and filled the room. The scent of her perfume arrived before she did. It was faint, the same floral blend I remembered from the night that nearly ended my life. Memory has a smell, and this one crawled through me like smoke. She stepped inside, looking smaller than I remembered. Time had carved its patterns across her face, but her eyes were the same. Sharp, assessing, searching for control. She carried a smile like a mask, something practiced enough to look real. I gestured toward the dining room, the same table I had been setting and resetting for days. Every inch of it had meaning. The candles burning evenly, the folded napkins, the envelope waiting at her seat. The clock on the wall ticked with the same rhythm it had 15 years ago. 7:45, the exact minute everything once stopped. I felt a strange symmetry in it, like fate keeping its own schedule. She moved through the room with the cautious grace of someone pretending comfort. I watched her eyes scan the setting, the plates, the wine, the soup still steaming in its pot. She didn't know, of course, that this wasn't a meal. It was a ceremony, a reconstruction of a crime scene disguised as civility. I poured the wine, steady-handed, letting the sound of liquid fill the quiet. The smell of the food carried through the air, thyme, garlic, mushrooms, and a trace of nostalgia. Every scent was chosen not to please but to provoke memory. The mind remembers in fragments, and I wanted hers to come undone piece by piece. She sat opposite me, her posture straight, her breathing shallow. I noticed the tremor in her fingers as she reached for the spoon. Not from age, from recognition. Some part of her knew, even if her mind refused to name it. Trauma leaves its fingerprints on the body. It remembers the rhythm of guilt long after the lie has settled. The first minutes passed in slow motion. The clinking of cutlery, the soft scrape of porcelain, the faint hiss of the candles burning low. Each sound felt amplified, each breath suspended. I could feel her eyes drifting toward mine, and then away again, as if the air between us might shatter. I focused on my breathing, slow, measured, deliberate. This was my kitchen now, my table, my hour. The space that once held fear now belonged entirely to me. The thought steadied my pulse, grounding me in the present even as the past kept whispering. The scent of the soup grew stronger, pulling memories to the surface like bubbles rising through heat. I remembered the taste of metal on my tongue, the collapsing floor, the white hospital ceiling that followed. I remembered the doctors saying I was lucky. I remembered how she cried beside my bed and told everyone I had simply eaten too fast. And I remembered how no one believed me. But tonight, she didn't have an audience. There was no one left to convince, just the two of us, the act and the consequence, finally sharing the same room again. I studied her face as she lifted the spoon, saw her lips tighten, saw the flicker of something behind her eyes. It wasn't fear yet, just confusion. Recognition without acceptance, the moment a buried truth starts scratching against the surface. The wine glowed in the candlelight, deep red like a wound that refused to close. The envelope by her plate remained untouched, patient, waiting for its purpose. Its edges caught the flame's reflection, and for a brief moment, it looked alive. There was a rhythm to the scene, a quiet pulse running underneath everything, hers and mine, hearts beating at different tempos, one fast, one steady. I knew she felt the imbalance. I wanted her to. Power shifts quietly when silence stops being submission and becomes control. I sat there, perfectly still, watching the small gestures that betrayed her. The twitch in her jaw, the way her hand brushed against her wrist, the tension building in her shoulders. Guilt has its own body language, and I had learned to read it fluently. The clock ticked to 8. The room seemed to hold its breath. Nothing was said, but everything was understood. This was the moment the balance of the past began to tilt. The meal continued, but it wasn't food being consumed. It was history, being digested in slow motion. By the time her spoon touched the plate again, I could feel it. The beginning of the unraveling. The taste of truth was finally in the air. It happened quietly, the way important things often do. 1 second, everything was balanced. The light, the air, the careful choreography of calm. And the next, something subtle shifted. The silence stretched too long, the room breathed too slowly, and I could feel the atmosphere start to fracture. She was holding the spoon again, turning it slightly, as if studying her reflection in the metal. The candlelight trembled across her face, and for an instant, I saw the version of her that existed in memory, the one who stood over me while the world blurred into darkness. The resemblance was uncanny. Time had changed the surface, not the structure. The same small movements, the same quiet calculation. 15 years had built a wall between that night and this one, but the wall was made of glass, and I could see straight through it. I realized, in that moment, that I didn't need her confession. I could read it in her body, the way her pulse moved under her skin, the stiffness in her jaw when the spoon reached her mouth. Guilt has no patience. It always finds a way to show itself. The air grew heavier as minutes passed. I took small sips of wine just to break the rhythm, pretending to savor it, though I barely tasted anything. My chest felt tight, but not from fear, from focus. I was watching her, waiting for the crack in her composure. And then it came. A small exhale, a change in posture, the kind of mistake that only happens when memory slips into the present. She froze for half a second, eyes unfocused, as though she had stepped through time. The spoon paused above the bowl, and her expression shifted. Not regret, not sorrow, but recognition. The realization of déjà vu so complete that her hand trembled again, spilling a single drop of soup onto the tablecloth. That sound, the faint tap of liquid against fabric, was microscopic, but to me it was thunder. It was the proof I didn't know I needed. The way her hand lingered there afterward, suspended above the stain, was almost ritualistic. She was staring at the mark as if she could already see the pattern of her own undoing forming around it. I didn't react. I let the moment sit, let it sink into her. Silence became my instrument again, sharp and deliberate. The more I withheld, the more her composure disintegrated. That's the thing about guilt. It cannot survive stillness. It needs chaos to hide inside. The room seemed smaller now. The candles hissed softly as their wicks bent under melted wax. The smell of thyme and garlic grew stronger, clinging to the air like something alive. She shifted in her chair, and I could hear the faint brush of fabric against wood, a nervous rhythm she didn't notice she was creating. I stared at the envelope near her plate. It waited there like a witness, silent but undeniable. I thought of everything inside it. The printed emails, the toxicology report, the scribbled note I had written to myself the night I decided to end the silence. It wasn't revenge I saw when I looked at it. It was restoration. The act of returning something stolen. My voice, my reality, my version of that night. Her breathing became shallow, her movements less precise. There was a flicker in her eyes that revealed more than words ever could. It was the moment when control slips from the hands of the guilty, when the mask doesn't just crack, but caves inward. I could sense her trying to collect herself, but memory has its own gravity, and she was being pulled into it. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning the table, the candles, the soup, everything she once believed she controlled. For the first time, I saw fear bloom in her like a slow poison. Not fear of me, but fear of herself. Fear of what she had done and the possibility that it was finally being seen. I took a deep breath, steady and slow, grounding myself in the moment. I wasn't 19 anymore, lying on the floor of a kitchen. I was 34, alive, standing in my own space, watching the past lose its power. The drop of soup on the cloth had already dried, leaving a faint, rust-colored circle, small but impossible to ignore. It looked almost like a wound. The balance had shifted. The dinner had become something else entirely, no longer a performance, but a revelation. The truth was no longer waiting to be spoken. It was already in the room, breathing through both of us. The silence in the room had taken on a shape of its own. It no longer floated. It pressed. The air seemed thicker, like it remembered what she had done and was waiting for me to acknowledge it. The candlelight carved slow-moving shadows across the table, stretching and curling like restless spirits. Every sound, the faint ticking of the clock, the breathing, the soft hum of the refrigerator, became a part of the rhythm. The world outside had disappeared. It was just her, me, and the truth, pulsing like a heartbeat between us. Her eyes wandered too much, looking for something to hold on to, something ordinary to distract her. But there was nothing ordinary left. Every object on that table was a mirror. The cutlery gleaming, the wine reflecting red, the envelope sitting between us like a confession written without words. It had waited patiently all evening. Now it demanded to be seen. I reached for it without hesitation. My fingers brushed the edge, the paper cool against my skin. It felt heavier than it should, weighted not by what it contained, but by what it meant. I placed it near her hand, not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough for her to notice that it was time. She didn't touch it. She just stared. The muscles in her face tightened slightly, her expression frozen between confusion and recognition. That hesitation was everything I needed. Guilt is physical before it's emotional. The body always knows the truth first. I kept my focus steady, breathing in rhythm with the clock. Inside that envelope was the entire architecture of her lie. The email, the report, the receipts, the fragments that together built a structure of intent. But I didn't need her to read it. I only needed her to see it and understand that I knew. The point was never punishment. It was awareness. For 15 years, she had lived with the comfort of denial, cushioned by the sympathy of others, protected by the assumption that no mother could do something so cruel. She had rehearsed her innocence so long that it had become a part of her identity. But truth has a different kind of endurance. It doesn't fade, it waits. And when it finally arrives, it strips away everything that was built on lies. She tried to keep her composure. I could see her posture adjust, her chin lift, her hands fold neatly in her lap. But still, there was that tremor, small, involuntary, betraying her. The more she tried to steady herself, the more her mask began to fracture. I thought about how many times I had imagined this moment. Not the confrontation itself, but the silence after. The sound of realization hitting her. The flicker of her eyes when the weight of truth settled into them. I thought I might feel triumph. But what I felt instead was gravity. A pulling down, a grounding. The kind of quiet that doesn't celebrate. It concludes. The candle nearest to her flickered violently, bending as the wax caved in on itself. I watched the flame fight to stay upright. It reminded me of her. Stubborn, determined to hold its shape even as it collapsed. The air smelled of time and smoke. I leaned back slightly, letting the moment breathe. The clock ticked past 8:30. Time, that indifferent witness, continued forward while we sat suspended in the loop of a memory replayed too many times. For years, I had been trapped in her version of the story. The dutiful daughter, the overdramatic patient, the lucky survivor. I had lived inside her narrative, forced to carry the weight of her performance. But tonight, I stepped out of it. I reclaimed the authorship of my own story. There was no shouting, no breaking point, no eruption. Only the subtle shift of energy when a lie finally meets its limit. Her shoulders sank slightly, her gaze faltered, and for the first time since she arrived, she looked small. Not old, just diminished, human, fallible. I didn't need to explain what she already understood. The truth had already spoken for me, silent but absolute. I felt my pulse slow, a calm spreading through me that I hadn't known in years. It wasn't victory, it was release. The kind that comes when the air you've been holding finally escapes your lungs. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the faint sound of it reached the window. The world continued, indifferent to our private reckoning. I thought of all the nights I had replayed this moment in my mind, wondering if it would bring closure. Closure, I realized, isn't an ending. It's the absence of need. I stood, collected the plates, and let the faint sound of porcelain fill the silence. She didn't move. Her hands remained on the table, fingers tense against the wood, as if she were holding on to something slipping away. Maybe it was control. Maybe it was the version of herself she had built. The truth didn't destroy her. It simply unmasked her. That's what truth does. It reveals, it equalizes, it leaves you exposed to the reality you've spent your life avoiding. When I turned off the lights, the room exhaled. The candles died slowly, one by one, their smoke curling into the air like quiet absolution. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted. The ghost of that night no longer lived here. It was over. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I knew endings never stay still. They echo. The echo of this one was only beginning. The morning after the dinner arrived without warning. I woke before dawn, unsure if I had truly slept or simply drifted through hours of darkness pretending to rest. The air in my apartment felt different, thinner somehow, as if the night before had consumed too much oxygen. I lay still for a long time, letting the quiet rearrange itself around me. It was strange, the feeling that followed. Not triumph, not even relief, just stillness. The hollow calm that settles after a storm has passed, but before you understand what has been destroyed. The sun hadn't yet reached the window, and the house was washed in the color of forgetting. The table was still set when I walked into the dining room. The plates cold, the candles hardened into small towers of wax. The brown envelope was gone. She must have taken it with her when she left. I imagined her holding it all night, fingers trembling against the paper, eyes scanning the evidence she could no longer deny. The thought didn't please me, it only confirmed what I already knew. There was nothing left to prove. I made coffee but didn't drink it. The smell alone was enough to keep me grounded. My hands moved automatically, tidying the table, collecting fragments of a night that had changed shape but not meaning. The tablecloth still carried a faint mark from where her wine had spilled. a small red bloom in the fabric. I ran my fingers over it, half expecting it to feel warm. Outside, the city began to wake. Cars, footsteps, lives beginning again without knowledge of what had happened in this small apartment. That contrast always fascinated me. The way life goes on in perfect ignorance of private catastrophes. To the world, it had been just another Saturday night. To me, it had been an autopsy of silence. Hours passed without direction. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, inspecting the scene of its own haunting. I replayed her face in my mind, the slow collapse of composure, the fragile dignity cracking at the edges. But it wasn't her fear that stayed with me. It was her eyes afterward. They weren't cruel anymore, just lost. The kind of lost that comes from realizing the lie that once protected you is now the thing that ruins you. I didn't hear from her for 2 days. The absence felt both deliberate and necessary. I told myself it was over. I had faced her. I had spoken without words. I had given the truth back to its rightful owner. But healing doesn't understand punctuation. It doesn't know how to stop cleanly. It drips. It lingers. It clings. On the third morning, I received a call. I didn't answer. The number was familiar but unmarked. Later, a message appeared from a relative I hadn't spoken to in years. Brief, unsure, written with the hesitance of someone delivering bad news. She had been taken to a clinic. Exhaustion, they said. A breakdown. I stared at the screen until the words blurred into nothing. There was no satisfaction in it. No victory. Only a strange, quiet ache that I couldn't name. I had always imagined justice as something clean, a revelation, a closure, an end. But this didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an inheritance I hadn't asked for. Her pain had folded itself into mine, reshaped but not erased. That night, I walked through the city aimlessly, letting the cold wind bite at my face. The streets glowed with life, restaurants alive with laughter, windows fogged with breath. I wondered how many of those people were carrying ghosts of their own, how many were smiling through histories that no one else could see. The thought didn't comfort me, but it made me feel less alone. When I returned home, the apartment felt both empty and alive. The walls held echoes of that dinner, the ghosts of 2 women sitting across from each other with years of unspoken truth between them. I imagined them from the outside, just a mother and daughter sharing a quiet meal, no one noticing the quiet violence of it. I poured a glass of water and stood by the window. The reflection in the glass didn't look like the girl who had once collapsed on a kitchen floor. She was gone. What remained was someone who had built herself from the fragments, patient, deliberate, cautious. In the following weeks, the restaurant became my sanctuary again. The familiar rhythm of work filled the spaces the past had hollowed out. I cooked more than usual, experimenting with flavors I'd avoided for years. One afternoon, without planning to, I made mushroom soup. The same kind. The smell filled the kitchen, and I waited for the panic to rise. It didn't. I tasted it. Just 1 spoonful. It was warm, rich, harmless. I realized then that I had finally reclaimed it. What was once a weapon had become nourishment again. Healing doesn't announce itself. It sneaks in quietly, disguised as ordinary moments. Sometimes I still think about her. Not the version that hurt me, but the one who existed before that. The woman who sang while she cooked, who believed in small joys. Maybe she's gone. Or maybe she was never real. Either way, I stopped searching for her. Some ghosts aren't meant to be resurrected. They're meant to be recognized and released. I don't know if she'll ever call again. I don't know if she'll ever apologize. But I no longer need her to. The truth doesn't require forgiveness to exist. Late at night, when the restaurant is empty and the lights dim to gold, I sometimes think of that dinner. The smell of thyme, the flicker of the candles, the envelope resting on the table. It no longer feels like revenge. It feels like symmetry. The world returning to balance after years of imbalance. I survived the poison. I survived her silence. And somewhere between those 2 survivals, I found myself again. That, I think, is what justice really is. Not punishment, not triumph, but continuation. The quiet persistence of life after someone tried to take it away. The year folded quietly around me. Seasons passed like gentle reminders that life continues even when you aren't paying attention. The restaurant thrived. The days filled themselves with motion, the kind that doesn't ask questions. But every night, when the last customer left and the lights dimmed, I felt the echo of that dinner pulsing softly in the background. Not as pain anymore, more like a low hum, the sound of truth living quietly beneath everything I did. It took me months to realize I was no longer waiting for her, no longer checking the phone for messages that never came, no longer searching for updates from distant relatives. Her silence, which once felt like a weapon, had become something else entirely. Distance, neutrality, peace. Sometimes healing means accepting that an apology will never arrive and understanding that you don't need it to move forward. One afternoon, while cleaning out old boxes in storage, I found a photograph of the house where it all began. The edges were yellowed, the paper curled with age. The image caught me off guard. The small porch, the cracked path, the kitchen window half open. It looked smaller than I remembered, almost harmless. I sat on the floor with the photo in my hands, studying it until memory blurred into imagination. The girl who lived there was gone, but the space she occupied still existed somewhere inside me. The decision to return came without reason, the way some instincts surface after years of dormancy. I told myself it was curiosity, but it felt more like gravity, an invisible pull back to the origin. I closed the restaurant for 2 days, packed light, and drove out before sunrise. The road was long and empty, the landscape shifting from city noise to quiet fields, then to the narrow, winding street that led to that forgotten house. It was still standing. Faded paint, wild grass, the windows shuttered. I parked outside and sat for a while, watching the place breathe. Time had taken its toll, softening its edges, erasing the sharpness of what once happened there. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. The walls no longer held me, and I no longer feared them. Behind the house stood an old oak tree, its roots breaking through the earth like veins. I walked toward it, carrying a small box I'd brought with me. Inside were the pieces I'd kept for years: the medical report, the photo, a copy of the email, the page torn from her recipe book. Relics of a life I no longer lived. I buried them beneath the tree, pressing the soil down with my hands until it felt firm, grounded, final. The air smelled of earth and rain. The sound of leaves above me whispered with the calm of closure. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, just a quiet surrender, the acknowledgement that some stories don't end with forgiveness or revenge, but with release. Standing there, I thought about the strange symmetry of it all, how poison had once ended a part of my life, and how now, in burying the evidence, I was ending its hold over me. It struck me that survival isn't about resisting death. It's about creating something that lives beyond it. I left the house without looking back. On the drive home, the landscape blurred into a palette of fading golds and deep greens. For the first time, I felt light, not free from the past, but no longer defined by it. That night, I returned to the restaurant and opened a new bottle of wine, the same kind I'd poured that evening. I lit a single candle and sat by the window, the city outside alive with noise. I raised the glass not in triumph, but in acknowledgement, to the girl who had survived, to the woman who had learned to live, and to the silence that had finally become peace. Justice, I realized, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet continuation, a steady pulse that keeps you moving forward. It's not about the downfall of those who hurt you. It's about building something beautiful where they left ruin. As the candle burned low, I whispered nothing into the night. No goodbyes, no prayers. Just breath, steady and unbroken. The circle had closed. The story had ended. And I was still here, alive, whole, and finally untouched by the poison that once tried to claim me.